Are you sometimes overwhelmed by the fact that as a leader, you are having to make critical decisions every single day? You're having to make decisions about direction. You're having to make decisions about personnel. You're having to make decisions about spending. In fact, when it comes down to it, what leadership is really all about, it's all about decision making. Hello, I'm Eric Wright, along with my business partner, Jeff Piersall, and we're here with TREP Talks to talk about topics that are keys to leaders and to entrepreneurs. And the one we're talking about today is so important. We call it the buck stops here. So, Jeff, entrepreneurs learn that making critical decisions is a part of their daily reality. It's critical, and it's both science and it's art.
Very much is.
So, Jeff, unpack that for us.
Well, you know, Eric, it's so critically important to understand that there's two aspects to every decision-making process. One of them is just your intuitive nature, or what we call the gut. Mm-hmm. And then, you know, the other is the intellectual process. And you need both of these. And that's the science and the art behind making decisions.
You know, I think about in Star Wars, Han Solo, you know, his statement is, oh, I got a bad feeling about this. And the fact of the matter is, sometimes our intuition is a great tool because our brain is actually processing reams of data that consciously we're not even aware of. We're looking at people's body language, their intonation, their facial expressions, and based on that, we come to decisions. But that's not the only decision-making tool that we have in our toolbox, is it, Jeff?
It isn't. And the other thing to understand is really critically important here is that the goal of making decisions, Eric, is about eliminating anxiousness.
Yes.
And if we can eliminate anxiousness from our process, we eliminate a whole lot of adverse effects to our business and also to us personally. So intuition is one of those things that we can tend to follow rather easily. Mm-hmm. You know, our gut tells us to do something, we feel it, you know, okay, we can box and handle that. But
it might be last night's sushi, right?
You know, what we need to do is create a process that really helps us through either our intuition or the intellectual process. And so I break it down to some basic steps. And the first one is you need to determine the risk versus the reward of this decision.
Good point.
So when you're faced with a particular decision that's coming to you, what's my risk reward analysis? Now, this starts to tell me, where does this decision rank in terms of importance? And the higher it moves up the ladder, the more intellectual aspect I need to bring in.
Right.
Knowing that ultimately it's probably going to end up being a gut decision, but I need to, second stage, gather all information. I've learned as a CEO, and I've repeated this so many times, and I think that all of us can relate to this. If I have all the information, making a good decision becomes very, very easy to do.
Right.
It's the situations where we get into that we don't get all the information that causes us the most anxiousness. The third step after gathering the information is to seek my mentors. If you don't have good mentors around you, Eric, and sometimes that can be the people in your office, you know, you think of the office of the president and it becomes his staff of all these different critical people. You know, I'm not going to make a decision about invading without going to my chief of staff of Army, Navy, you know, Air Force. And the same is true in what we're doing in business all the time. If I've got finance involved in this decision, I want my chief of financial officer or the controller of my business to be involved in that. So again, it's determine the risk reward, gather all information, seek my mentors, and then don't sit in what I call the engineer's analysis paralysis state. Because what an engineer will do, and it's not against, got a lot of great engineers that are friends, 3 brothers that are engineers. So, you know, I love engineers, but when you get to the point where you're in analysis paralysis and you're trying to figure everything out before you make a decision, you're never going to make a decision.
Right.
You got to go ahead and decide, and then be ready to tweak that decision as information comes back as feedback. I've made the decision. Things are now coming. Boy, don't get your heels so dug in that your ego is so close to your position that you can't adjust on the fly.
Oh, so true. It's funny. We've all probably got an EKG or had our blood work done or something like that. And the doctor always comes out and gives you that stuff, but it's absolutely meaningless to you because you don't know how to interpret it. Well, that can be true for financial statements. That can be true even with these risk-reward scenarios. You need people that have the expertise to be able to interpret that to help make the decision more self-apparent. But it all comes down to that critical ability to actually make the call. That's what defines us as leaders. Now, you alluded to something earlier that I want to go back to, Jeff.
Sure.
You said in order to make critical decisions, we have to remove anxiety from the decision-making scenario. And when we're agitated, psychologists will tell you, we naturally go into flight or fight mode. So blood actually drains from your brain down into your muscles. And here you've got to make this very critical decision, a decision that affects your future, maybe the future of your company. And instead, you're acting like you're fighting a mastodon instead of trying to make a decision objectively, rationally. So, Jeff, how do you do that? How do you balance that out?
Well, Eric, some of it is life experience and training. I'm a former high school and college basketball coach.
Right.
And if you want to think about decision making and training for decision making, become a basketball coach. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, in the game of basketball, it's a fast-paced game. You got two 20-minute halves. And in amongst of that 20-minute halves, you're going to make probably close to 100 decisions.
If not more, yeah.
But you're making them at the speed of light. You don't have time to sit and go and ponder. You got to make a decision. And guess what? You got to convey that decision with great confidence. And there's sometimes that you're making a decision that is totally off the wall. It's counterintuitive, but it's the right decision. And you got to convince your players that it's the right decision because of the strength of your leadership. Sometimes at a timeout, you can get some quick advice, from your other assistant coaches that will help you drive a decision. But basketball coaching is a great training ground in terms of how to actually be able to make decisions. The biggest part that I find most people they really struggle with is they're trying to eliminate all confusion and doubt before making a decision.
Right.
The greater the decision, the less likely you're going to be able to do that. And when you come to grips with that and just go, okay, I got to make the call. Now, as long as you're in a place where doubt is grasping you and keeping you from moving, the single best answer that I can give to you is you've got to continue to pray for guidance.
Yeah.
You've got to seek wisdom. Now, a lot of people may think that that's spiritual and religious, but I'm here to tell you after thousands of interviews across this country of successful CEOs, they all turn to prayer for an answer.
It's interesting, Jeff, as you were saying that, one of the things that was coming to my mind is, golly, that's one of the things that almost moves you emotionally out of the fight and flight mentality into a more rational, peaceful, objective mentality.
And Eric, I think a lot of times, and you've seen this in your practice where, people will say, turn to prayer. Well, they never define what that means. And, I think we need to put some tangible aspects to it because sometimes that just seems so airy and fairy, it's just hard to grasp. What will happen in my experience is that when you sit down in solitude and you pray on that particular topic and you ask for guidance, you ask for wisdom, in the next day or the following day, while you're trying to come up with that decision, it is unbelievable how messages are brought to you and they're just laid out right in front of you and the answer becomes obvious. It's not like somebody's going to come down and just beat you over the head with a hammer.
Yeah.
And while you're sitting there that evening, you get an answer.
Right.
But it is in that moment of silence and in that moment of seeking clarity that all of the confusion seems to just drift away and you start to gain clarity and messages are brought to you by other people or by circumstances.
Well, I think of two things as you were saying that, Jeff. I remember somebody said one time that he said, some people think answered prayer is just a coincidence, but it's amazing how the coincidences go up when I pray. And it's true. I mean, that's quite honest. The other thing is when you really take the time to humble yourself, to recognize that you're not the source of all wisdom and knowledge, you're opening your mind and you're looking for answers from different sources. Right. And if you're not looking for those answers, if you're not asking for that kind of help, well, when that help comes, as you say, it might be delivered to you and you don't even recognize it. You don't
Eric,
even take it.
This goes back to remembering one of the first TREP Talks we ever did. And it sets down the ultimate goal of what your life is all about. And if you understand that goal is to seek wisdom in everything you do, well, then if this is my ultimate goal for living, then everything else starts to fall in place behind that. And now critical decision making starts to make more sense to me, and I've got a logical pathway to be able to follow. I would remind all of our listeners that the purpose of Dogs Don't Bark at Parked Cars, the book that Eric and I put together, is that it is a foundation. And if you just think about building a building, you've got to dig a hole first, and then you got to fill that hole with the foundation. Well, Dogs Don't Bark at Parked Cars is that foundation for your life and your decision-making process, especially in business. But we have found so many people that have read the book and have sent back testimonials of, I'm getting my children to read this because it gives them a foundation to be able to live their life.
Right.
And I think I would strongly encourage people to remember that those principles are a foundation.
Yeah, Jeff, I had no idea that you were going to take this direction, that we took, but I'm so glad that you did because it's so important. One other closing point as we talk about decision making and how challenging this is. If you have an ethical grid, if you have a set of objective, hey, we do this and we don't do that, that will answer a lot of your questions. You don't have to go through this anxious debate. Should I do this or should I not do it? It comes down to, is this right or is it wrong? If it's wrong, we don't do it.
Right.
If it's wrong, but we'll maybe make money in the short term. If it's wrong, it'll bring us alliance in the short term. Still, we don't do it because we have this objective criteria that answers the question for us. That is how we make life simple. And sometimes we make life so complex, and it really isn't complex if you stick to those basics that Jeff was just now talking about. I really want to thank you for being here. Any other closing thoughts that you have as we finish up?
I mean, Eric, it's an ethical grid, sometimes, called the plumb line. And you can find in your life, the further you get from right and the further you get from left of that plumb line, the more difficult life becomes. Yeah. And you just got to get that plumb line, establish it, and make your decisions from there.
That's so good. You're going to be making critical decisions as a leader. You're going to be making critical decisions as an entrepreneur. You're going to be making critical decisions as a dad or a mom. Trust me, life is full of critical decisions. And as we began this program, we called it The Buck Stops Here. Well, a buck is the hilt of a knife. And back in the days of the cowboys, they pointed that hilt at the person who was to deal next. Well, sometimes you just can't pass the buck. You can't turn that hilt towards somebody else because it's up to you to make those decisions. And we want you to be successful in your decision-making process. Thank you so much for being with us. If you want more information, please go to trepfreedom.com, where Jeff and I have videos and videos from other individuals, also articles that will help you in your entrepreneurial and personal journey. Thanks so much.